everyone for joining the David Hume Institute today for this session, Talking Tech with Stephen Drost and Chris Yu. We have a really mixed audience, some regular attendees and some new ones, and we welcome you all. My name is Susan Murray and I'm Director of the David Hume Institute, which is a think tank based in Edinburgh, and we mainly research the economy and public policy related areas. Now, it would have been hard to miss the growing importance of technology to the Scottish economy. The latest estimates now show it employs a fifth of people in Edinburgh and Glasgow. And our guests today are very much more knowledgeable than me on this subject. Stephen Drost is Chief Strategy Officer at the UK's largest tech incubator, CodeBase. He spends a lot of his time thinking about the social impacts of technology and how policy can intervene for good. He currently stars in the podcast Startupification. Chris's work focuses on improving the dialogue between those changing the world with new technologies and those seeking to respond to it with public policy and regulation. Chris was previously General Manager at Uber and has held very senior roles in several public, private and third sector organisations. Now, with two such knowledgeable people, I don't want to steer the conversation too much. I am really struck by the format of Stephen's podcast, Startupification, where the conversation flows and ideas generate spontaneously. Now, having been in a conversation with Chris and Stephen, it was phenomenal, wide-ranging, and really wonderful for not being steered. So I'm going to step back a little bit. I will interject with questions, and I will ask the audience to share their questions in the chat as well. And I'll interject with those at various points. And in planning for this session, we had a rough talk over what buckets might come up of areas, but then having spoken to Stephen this morning and the person that you interviewed yesterday, your brain was in a slightly different place, and I was like, oh, if we could capture some of what is most in Stephen's brain today, that might be really fascinating too. So I'll leave it open to you two where you want to go with this, but what we said we might start with the other day was talking about the perceived need for change and the actual need for change, and a few reflections on the Scottish tech ecosystem and where it might go next. So Stephen, do you want to kick off with that?
Sure, why not? So a lot of words to say that this conversation will be very meandering and wide-ranging. Chris and I have spoken a few times in the past, and I think we both quite favour that way of communicating. So that's the kind of warning, I guess. I think we are looking at change as the major theme, and that change, I guess, is being driven by in many cases by technology and new technologies becoming available, and those new technologies then creating a whole sort of landscape around investment and business models and all sorts of new things that are coming on the market. And then on the other hand, we have a bunch of sort of incumbent things in our lives, which are looking to understand that change. There's a paradigm that calls that looking at sustaining innovations, so doing the same thing you've been doing for a while but in new ways, and then disruptive innovations, doing brand new things. And I think we live in a time where technology is doing both at the moment. Mostly incumbents are kind of dealing with sustaining innovations, but there are brand new things, brand new disruptive innovations. You know, we're doing this talk today on Zoom. That could be seen as a kind of disruptive way of doing things. And I think that's where we're positioned. The challenge for Scotland, or for any location, frankly, outside of the sort of mega cities or places where these big change engines sit, is how do we engage with these moments of change? How do we start to understand them so that we're not just sort of subjected to them, but we can participate in them? I think that's kind of where we're at, and I think that'd be good for us to talk about some of that today.
Yeah, and you know, I always think, because you mentioned there the difference between sustaining innovation and disruptive innovation, and I think this is like quite connected to some of the policy conversations we have about like the tech environment, the tech ecosystem, like what will it take to put us on a different trajectory? Because a lot of the political attention is often on, you know, the kind of whiz bang high tech, I'm going to shoot a thing into space, or I'm going to completely alter some nanotechnology, whatever, right? And that's important and it's really valuable. But then you go and look at the history of innovation, and lots of the disruptive innovations that have changed the world, like Zoom is included in this category, I think. It's not that stuff at the bleeding edge, right? It's actually about the intelligent combination of commodity technologies in a new way that solves a problem and makes people's lives easier. And to do that is a different then discussion about, from a policy perspective, what do you need? Because the former is like, I need a stack of people with PhDs and I've got to build a fusion reactor. And the other is like, I've got to mainstream a different sort of approach to education. People need different baseline skills. I've got to have a different support environment for small businesses trying to do new things against large incumbents. And like the latter of those is not always particularly, it's not so sexy for politicians. It's like harder to get your head around because it's like all these different interlinked interventions, which any one of them in isolation, you'd say, well, is it worth the candle? But together, maybe it changes things. So like getting people to understand in the policy debate that it's not all about the ribbons and the satellites. And it's more about a lot of like the hard, arduous work of changing lots of small things.
That's a really good point. And I think that breaks down very often into buckets. Sorry, I like to say buckets a lot. It breaks down into buckets that are sometimes, as you say, they're complex, and it's a complex system, frankly, and it's difficult to sort of separate these things sometimes, and difficult to articulate any kind of positive vision as to what a policy could look like. And very often, instead, we're left with the most kind of visible buckets. So you're absolutely correct. The whiz bang stuff is kind of easy to point at because you can go, hey, there's lots of PhD, clever people building this thing. Another part that's normally quite easy to point at is something like digital skills. You'll say, hey, that existing industry, if we could only train people better, they could do all this kind of stuff. But actually, I think probably the meaty stuff, the hard to grasp stuff, that actually has the most kind of opportunity really is somewhere in the middle about, how do you convert that kind of whiz bang deep tech, shall we call it, into actual products that people can use? And how, on the other hand, can you change sort of working culture and change different ways that people can participate in this new kind of fast changing place, not just participate as employees, but also start to create your own kind of flavor or your own kind of version of things. I think we're living in a moment where, so I'm going to just quote a lot of Peter Thiel and stuff like that, where you've got a kind of libertarian strand that will say, the only companies worth creating are monopolies. And if you look at the stock market, you'll have the, Facebook and Amazon and Google and Apple and Microsoft, things like that, also grabbing this huge chunk of the overall value, and you've got all these smaller things kind of clustering around them. And if you take that even further and say, well, what will a local version of that look like for different parts of the world, and how do we want to sort of live? Do we want to have those big massive monopolies and then lots of tiny little sort of so-called zebra companies now, I guess, around that, or do we want to look at that in a different way? And I think that's the conversation that we need to have, and I don't really think people are having that conversation really in those terms.
Yeah, and there's a pragmatic aspect of that as well, which is like you might mount the argument, maybe we debate it a bit about like the nature of the internet and modern technology businesses, and whether, so you take your point about some of those large technology companies. You might argue it's inevitable that they've grown to that kind of scale, right? If most of your cost base is fixed and your marginal costs are zero or close to zero, then your best business model is to monetize over as large a customer base as possible. Mm-hmm. And so there's something that I think we ought to reckon with, and you see it's happening in London at the moment with all this debate about like, can we build a $1 trillion British tech company? Mm. And I don't know, maybe you can, but not if the addressable market is the population of the United Kingdom.
Yeah.
And so, or put it another way, like, should we be chasing those models, or would you say actually, you know, that's the early 2000s version of the internet?
Yeah.
There's a different set of businesses with a different approach and different culture that come next, and maybe there's a European version of this which feels nothing like the American model. But do you think it's viable though? Like here, like in the UK or in Scotland or in Europe even?
I don't know. I think sometimes when I walk around the streets in Edinburgh, I look at the house prices and the houses we have, and I think, how does that local economy create those kind of pricing moments? It just seems impossible. But then you look at something like Skyscanner or something that does trade globally, you can start to see where value is being created. But to top down say, let's build $1 trillion company, when the way that actual, Amazon and I think it's three, right? It's Amazon, Microsoft, and Apple, I believe. How they were created is very different. And if you look at someone like Jeff Bezos, who kind of openly says, Amazon will die one day. It will be disrupted. It will be obsolete. It will be a different thing. Then it just seems that you're kind of, a big fan again, bullshit bingo alert, of thinking about mimesis. I think we're just copying those ideas and saying, that'll be a really great deal. The British version is very much of this government. It's like, yeah, hurrah, we'll build $1 trillion company. The EU version is, we'll build an EU government version of Amazon, right, for hosting. That's their big idea now. I think that those things are very, very top down. Normally those things don't really work, at least not directly, maybe indirectly. So I'm not sure is the answer, Chris, but I think at any rate there should be. I'll tell you what my humble sort of position in this would be. I think it's dangerous for us to just become employees of those big behemoths. I also think it's dangerous for us just to have the ambition to create small local things. I think we do need an ambition to create unicorns. I know it's a kind of loathsome position somehow. I understand that, but I do think we need that ambition, and a mixture of unicorns and smaller companies, I think, is the ambition we need to have. Whether we'll get there, I don't know. Building $1 trillion company from scratch without the ecosystem around it, without the people who, no one's ever done that here. No, what are you going to do? You're going to hire all the people away from Apple to build it? I don't know. That seems foolhardy to me.
Yeah. You could argue the closest we ever got was DeepMind. And some people have made this argument that maybe, from a policy perspective, somebody should have blocked the acquisition of DeepMind by Google on the grounds that what you've now done is like Europe's sole hope for an AI champion is now a subset of one of the American companies. And the hypothetical debate to have in the pub sometime is, should you have taken $1 billion from the UK defense budget and protected DeepMind? But that ship has sailed.
To stay with DeepMind for a while, so I remember I was with some like EU delegation thing the day. There's another startup called Bloomsbury AI who were sold to Facebook. They were the kind of after DeepMind, and a bunch of people in that company were part of this of postgrad. I think it's UCL, Imperial College, Oxford or so, like proper creme de la creme of European, not just British, of European sort of brain power. And I think, DeepMind was, I can't remember the number, but it was sold for a couple of £100 million, I believe. Bloomsbury was sold, I think, for 25 million. And I think Bloomsbury, I had 25 employees. So it was kind of, that's what the unit metrics were. And I think that argument that, that's very, very cheap, even, a couple $100 million for DeepMind's very cheap. At the same time, back to that $1 trillion vision, I think DeepMind still, amazing as it is, it's still not a clearly articulated product, I don't think. It's a bunch of service. That's not a bad thing. If you look at, there's a whole bunch of companies that pretend to be products. They're not really, they're just service people doing a bunch of stuff. But I think we're just so far away from understanding what would be required to build that. It might be, might be good to state that kind of ambition, but I think that's really, really difficult. I think what would interest me is how do we articulate some kind of state involvement? Because let's not kid ourselves, I think state involvement has been pivotal in the US as well. That whole libertarian, the state did nothing, apart from
Mm.
DARPA and the internet. It's just not, is not that, not that truthful. So I think it's really interesting to think about how the state can intervene, at what level, what's the best practice piece for that. And look at that. One of my favorite sort of buckets again, and that would be how do you look at, on the one hand, education to get there? So how do you invest in people? And the other piece is, like, do we have the right institutions to make that possible? What do you think about the institutions question? Yeah.
And just to frame that a little bit more, I think that one thing I really like is Tom Loosemore, who used to work at the UK Government Digital Service. He has posted what he calls his definition of digital, where he says it's not just the technology, right? He says it's about applying the culture, processes, business models, and technologies of the internet era to respond to people's raised expectations. And I just want to add that in because I think it's really pertinent to the question about institutions, because I think that often the debate becomes, well, like, how do I reform institutions in order to be stronger on just the technical aspects, right? So it's like, I need more coding in schools, and I need, more and different sorts of financial support schemes, and so on and so forth. And then it's easy to neglect the other part of this, which is to do with the culture and the mindsets and how you equip people for, like, this very different world they're going to operate in. And so for me, there's some straightforward institutional reforms that you need to make, where you say, look, you look at the curriculum and you'd say it's clearly deficient in a number of arenas, and it's not about one thing in competition with another. It's more like we just don't teach kids well enough on critical thinking, logic, computer science, like all the debate, which I think is fascinating, about computer-based maths, and this notion that it's 2020, like, we've got the most powerful computational equipment like ever imagined at our fingertips, and yet, like, if you break down a regular like maths curricula, like these 4 components of, like, define the problem, turn the handle, check your answer, and then ask, what does it all mean? And it's like we spend 90% on the turn the handle section, when we should be spending, like, most of the time on define the question and what does it mean, and using the technology to turn the handle really, really efficiently. So there's all those sorts of things. And then the other part of it that I think is super interesting is like, what are the sorts of innovations you can make in the learning environment, but school and outside school and in university and other places, which is about like, work is going to be different, right? Like, and so the things that are really going to matter and the things that will persist are your ability to collaborate, your ability to communicate well, to work with other people, to be entrepreneurial. That stuff, in a world where work is more fluid and more people will start more businesses rather than work for large companies, and more people have to shoulder more risk, that probably matters a lot more than teaching people the latest version of Python or Java or whatever else, which is by definition going to be out of date the moment they hit the workforce. Yeah. But that stuff's hard, right? Because, like, I understand how to examine someone and give them a grade, and I'm much less clear, like, how do I assess your entrepreneurial spirit?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I've had some conversations with sort of universities around this, and you're absolutely right. A good way to articulate this, or give you an example of your very last point, is that whenever they come up with so creating new courses anyway is really, really hard, and it's difficult to even hire the right people to understand what a new course would look like. And when you do, the newer the course is, or the harder it is to articulate what the kind of payoff is for it, the harder it is to grade it. And you'll see, I think there's been a bunch of false dawns on how to grade. So, when I talk to people about some ideas we could do together, it's always like, okay, we'll just do pass fail. It starts off with that, and then it goes into, well, maybe we can have things peer reviewed, or people can grade each other. The thing that's super interesting on that is that, again, just through this sort of the capital structure around education, is that I guess when, you know, my parents didn't go to university, but their generation would have been paid to go to university. Not only did they, you know, they would actually get money. My generation, I'm 46, we didn't have to pay to go to university, and the current generation have to pay to go to university. So within that, I'm reliably informed by, because every university tells me this, students nowadays don't want to get pass-fail things. They want to essentially purchase good degrees, and you know, because they think that'll, you know, get them a better job, or their parents think that, or whatever the case may be. So that whole piece, the incentives there are really difficult to work out, because I completely agree with you. I think that entrepreneurial piece, or how do you build your own thing, that kind of even side hustle world, or whatever you want to call it, is going to be more pronounced, it seems, at least for the next, you know, for the next time, next while. And I think we just don't really have a curriculum there. On the other hand, we have, and this is almost the bit that's really difficult for me when I talk to a university, because at some point I'll always have to use the word educate, and I always feel stupid using that word with educators. But there's, into that void, into that gap, accelerator programs have jumped in. And that's super interesting, because there's loads of criticism could be leveled at them. We're happy to do that. But just to outline what that looks like, it's a kind of educational program that's entirely run by venture capital, essentially. The output of that education is to create as much human capital and as much knowledge as possible, so those people can start, you know, go to the starting line of that entrepreneurial thing and receive investment, because venture capital works that, you know, through spraying and praying, essentially, through making as many investments as you can possibly make, because it's a numbers game of capped downside and infinite upside. So you can lose, but you want 1,000x return on the one good thing that works. And to make that whole logic work, you have to create as many people, as many companies as possible. So it seems we've got that kind of, you know, ultra accelerator education piece on the one hand, and on the other hand, you've got, being slightly unfair or facetious, university stuff that, you know, maybe isn't even teaching first principles thinking. It's maybe teaching stuff that was maybe relevant a while ago, but not so much now. And I think bridging those two realities is something that we need to look at as well.
Yeah, yeah. And I think sometimes there's, I don't for one second think this is anything like the whole solution, but you start to see now things that are a little bit in the middle, where you find, like, you demonstrate through delivery rather than by passing tests, but it's not as far as your kind of VC model. So I'm thinking of something I saw, which was in Palo Alto High School in California, right? So their media program is super interesting, because it's, you know, it's a kind of blended learning approach, right, where the students are in charge and the teaching staff are there very much as guides and mentors, rather than as people who stand and, you know, tell you how it is, like, to the point where when you go and visit, the teachers are just like sitting in their staff room, and the students come and find them when they need them, and otherwise they just press on. But they press on in a way which is very very much more aligned with the real world, right? So they are, it's an applied course, right? So they're like running a journal, and like they, you know, they self-organize themselves into editorial teams and technical teams and all this kind of stuff, and they do all their own production. But then the metrics are not, you know, what does the assessor think of the quality of the, right? The metrics are, you know, you post your daily news bulletins on YouTube, how many people watch them?
Yeah.
Right? You know, what are the page views on your website? Like all this kind of stuff, which is about tangible, the same way that now if you're in any tech-enabled startup, you know, you spend most of your, maybe not most, right, you spend a lot of your time obsessing about your live metrics, because you've got it all available in real time, and you see how the decisions that you make affect the course of your business. So it feels to me like there are ways to start to give people that sort of experience, and for people to figure out, like, is that an environment that they thrive in, or is that an environment they find really challenging?
Yeah.
Before you get to, like, what do I do? Do I apply for a grad scheme, or do I join a startup?
Yeah, no, agreed. And I think we need things like that. And sometimes I worry that we live in a world that's all about sort of self-optimization and then stoicism. It's like hurry, don't worry. And I don't know at all how to articulate a kind of alternative to that. But what certainly is an alternative that's a workable one is to carry on doing things the way we're doing now, which is pretending that that's not happening. I think there's, I was looking at some sort of Gen Z research data the other day, and if you're just born, I'm old enough to remember what it was like to not have, I wrote handwritten letters, and my exams were written on paper and stuff like that. But if you're born to like social media native, not just web native or internet native, but actually, born with TikTok or whatever, your bullshit detector around that top-down authority piece that says this is good versus someone looking at the amount of likes or the amount of sort of pseudo transparent metrics on something that's a very different mindset, and with lots of bad parts too as well. Don't get me wrong, there's horrendous effects of that as well. But I think creating some kind of curriculum that understands that those are new realities for people, and that authority is different now, and a sort of perceived locus of control is different, and that the people can just hack a whole bunch of stuff together by themselves, and go and test things. I think we really need an environment that understands that that's reality.
Yeah.
I was struck, Stephen, by your reflection on the difference between the Stanford corridors and universities in the UK. Do you want to say something about that?
Yeah, well, I guess there's a couple of things. On the one hand, again, I'm trying not to be too entrepreneurial here. There's that kind of cliche that Stanford dorms are just like incubators, essentially, right? Everyone's just there to build a startup, and the dichotomy there, I guess, or the different boxes are, on the one hand, you've got critical thinking, all the things that logic, all the things that Chris mentioned earlier, and then you've got kind of playbooks where you're just trying to see how far you can go with new thoughts. That's one way of looking at that. Another thing is like the MIT thing, where if you go to MIT, you might have a vision of like grandeur in your head or something, but if you walk on the corridors, it's all kind of broken, and it's like that on purpose, because they just want agency from students to go. I mean, it's a technical university, so they want people to like fix plugs and walk around with screwdrivers and stuff like that. So I mean, I'm really not here to advocate for some Americana. I'd love for Europe, and I strongly see Britain as part of Europe still, to articulate some kind of third way between. I'm just worried that there's a kind of Americana way of looking at AI and building big business, and there's a kind of Chinese way, and this is not too simplistic. There's other stuff as well, obviously, but that I think it's telling that we don't experiment that much anymore, and I think it's a sign of a lack of confidence, frankly, to say that we're just looking to which thing can we latch onto, and if we had a more experimental, more open, more playful way of looking at change that we could explore and come up with our own kind of flavor of stuff, totally looking at existing playbooks and modulating them and mapping them across to how we want to build things. But that's how I would like to look at stuff.
So do you think we can develop that confidence?
What do you think, Chris?
I'll tell you what I would build on top of that, which is, and I think where a lot of our institutions have a role to play, it's about putting a bit of, like, you need something around this which gives all the things that we've been describing purpose. And so to your point about like US versus China, like my interpretation of that is that you've got three models. You've got the US, like hyper-capitalist, I'm going to build a $1 trillion company, if not larger. You've got the kind of Chinese authoritarian model of internet governance and technology and business intertwined with the state and everything that goes with that. And then you've got like emerging third attempt, which is the European philosophy, which, to boil all the way down, it's basically like we're going to be more ethical. Ethical privacy protecting everything else. And the hypothesis seems to be that if we are more ethical and more just, this is going to be a strong enough third pole. And my contention is that's lovely, but it's not going to work, because the truth is, like everything we've learned, is that being ethical sounds great, but actually people need stuff to work, right? So, but I wonder, like, there's something, I think there's a massive gap around applying technology for public purpose, and it's not just limited to public service delivery, but it's about, you know, applying tech to radically improve health, education, transportation, justice, all these sorts of issues where there's a huge delta between like the progress that Google and Microsoft and everybody has made on consumer tech and the stuff that really makes a difference to people's lives. And it's this environment where actually, like, there's a role for politics and policy and government to say, actually, this is what we need, and these are the guardrails, and no, you can't just whatever scrape everyone's profile picture and use it to real-time identify people in the streets. However, we could do a significantly better job on making sure that if I need to book a GP appointment, I can get one without having to pick up an old-fashioned telephone or wait in a waiting room. Somewhere in the middle, it's like if you could just harness the energy towards things that matter to people's lives, and you get over the kind of, you get enough of it moving that it becomes exciting and self-reinforcing. But, you know, it needs leaders in tech and in policy, otherwise one or the other, like the policy people have no credibility on tech, and the tech people are like, well, you're just a bunch of tax avoiding American capitalists, right? You got to put it together.
No, I agree. I think I think it's interesting. Cynically, I think we're really good at articulating the desire for having a discourse level about justice, and all that comes with that, and all the good stuff that comes with that as well. But we're not so strong in articulating the mechanics of how to achieve that, let alone how that interweaves with technology. And what the thing that worries me is that an ethical stance, you know, and this is actually Marxist thinking, that an ethical stance is really based on how much, on the wealth of a nation, frankly. So you can afford to be, you know, yada 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 ethical because, you know, people are, their bellies are full and all that kind of stuff. And again, that might be seen as super cynical, but I worry that that's underrated as a potential sort of human state of affairs, and that, you know, Europe's kind of dining off of the ill-gotten gains, if you want to call them such, and they probably are through many lenses of the past, and are therefore kind of articulating this kind of ethical position, but don't really know how to articulate a positive vision for Europe that creates more wealth going forward, that can be distributed and can, you know, create a bigger pie. That's the bit that really worries me. And the other side's, you know, I think, you know, Trump showed up a whole lot of, you know, nastiness and you know, stuff that many people would sort of disagree with, and at the same time also showed that he didn't understand the technology piece at all. So I think I'm hopeful that that's been kind of discarded in that sense. But how we articulate, you know, so for example, the example you just gave about sort of telemedicine, you know, I know a telemedicine startup fairly well, and one of their challenges is that that ironically only really healthy people, i.e. young people, move to telemedicine, and essentially their technology is just sorting for healthy people, and all the people, you know, in our lives, a normal person or average person statistically will not need any kind of medical help until the last sort of 6 months of their lives or something before they die. And so, you know, so we've got those things, but we don't know the business model, we don't know the distribution piece around it, we don't know any of that. And I'm worried that we just don't, back to your question, Susan, we're not experimenting, we're not trying to see how that works. And I think that would be a great thing for us to do, because at some point it'll be too late.
Yeah, and we don't think enough about like the systems and the incentives, like back to your institutions point. So with the telemedicine example, like a lot of the resistance that you seem to hear is, to your point, right, the apps take out all the easy to treat patients, and what used to be like the profile of then, you know, a family doctor's working day is very different, because now just like hard case after hard case after hard case. But like, so then the knee-jerk response is, well, shut down the apps, right? Because they've made it all different. Whereas the correct answer would be, I need to look at the incentives in the system, and maybe I should reward the doctors that deal with the hard patients significantly more than I reward the doctors that deal with easy people in a run. And the people that take the risk of seeing the patients face to face should be treated differently to the ones who sit in a high-tech call center. But that's a much knottier question about the structures and institutions and bureaucracy, really. And the technology is just like a kind of adjunct to that. But if you don't have that willingness to examine the whole system, then it's like, well, go and do your shiny app, or it's all too difficult.
Well, totally. I was I spoke to one of the sort of biggest investors in the world last night, a guy called Brad Feld from Techstars. So for context, something like 26% or something of all Series A invested startups in the US, he's invested in them. So like a mega big investor. And I was talking to him about the kind of, I asked him, do you see a place for new institutions within this kind of mix? And and his answer was just super pragmatic. It's like, I don't know, test it, just and again, I think all too often I'd rather try to offer suggestions for experiments rather than opinions on what the right thing is. And again, I'm worried that we just don't have enough space for that. So if anything, Susan, to your original question about going forward, it would be so awesome if Scotland, as a relatively small country, could try to experiment with the creation of new institutions that bring together this kind of conversation, right? So you identify who the players are in an ecosystem. You not just identify the different components, but also the dynamics between them. So what does it look like when a university talks to the state, or vice versa? How does big business play a role? What does small companies look like, etc.? So that kind of conversation, I think, would be really helpful. And I think that would also be playing potentially to the strengths of Europe, and to have that ethical piece baked into that and have that guiding that particular kind of experiment would be it would be a USP. It would be a differentiator to what else is going on. So I think that would be really interesting.
Yeah, and then one of the exciting questions in here is like, what are the interventions that you can make that like structurally improve your ability to experiment? So, and in that, like, I would count some things which would potentially be quite radical, but are also, I think, like realistic to pull off at the scale of 4 or 5 million people, which is, and this might not be the right answers, right? But should you mandate an API for every public service, or public services plus, like, financial institutions and others, so that people can build things around the edges of them without permission?
Yeah.
Should you send a Chromebook to every person under the age of 18?
Yeah.
Don't know, like maybe you should, maybe you shouldn't, but like those are the sorts of things that if you could have then the debate about structural increase in our ability to be innovative and to experiment and to try stuff, basically.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And just create a culture where it's acceptable to hack about and do these things, but also have a layer of and again, this might sound contradictory, but I strongly believe that the ultimate expression of ethics is actually in the articulation of a business model, because that's where the rubber hits the road, right? So you can, that's where you can judge as to what a thing's trying to do. So working out business models is super interesting. And if you look at the history of the internet and the sort of fledgling parts of the web, the way that everything's run by advertising wasn't really planned. I mean, it just wasn't. And so it's almost like we're stuck on this. We've quadrupled down on this this one thing that wasn't planned. It was just an accident that stuck, and we're just going with it all the time. So playing around with those things, at least. The lights have to stay on. We need to stay warm and fed and everything. But like a tiny bit of risk taking and a tiny bit of experimentation, I think would be super welcome. And I think Scotland is of the size that it could be an interesting place to do that.
So we've got a question in from Jenny on the role of tech in helping to combat climate change and biodiversity depletion. I wonder if you two have a view on that.
Yeah, I'm happy to. So I just very recently had a conversation about both those topics. So, you know, my day job, we're running a program we're calling Energy Tech with a bunch of, well, I can't say the names, but like big sort of companies that used to call themselves oil and gas companies. Now, interestingly, always want to be called energy companies. And you know, so if you look at windmills, for example. One of the big problems they have is bird strike, right? And so biodiversity and energy lumped into one. And if you talk to these people, you'll see all the strange kind of experimentation that's going on. It actually goes back to Chris's point about APIs. So there's a startup in Spain, for example, that can sit on top of those windmills and take photographs. Essentially of the surrounding area, and then the idea is that if birds are coming close, that they can stop the blades from rotating, because the blades rotate very, very deceptively quick. It doesn't seem like that because they're so huge. And so technology is sitting on all of those different parts, and you know, creating hopefully good outcomes and also new business models again. So yes, totally got a place for that. You know, that kind of example is a good one because it starts off with like, how can you repurpose our existing technology by putting it over there? What's the business model on top of that? Do you pay per bird saved, or is it per hour of recording? Or, you know, to Chris's point, you have the chance to articulate different incentive contexts, right? So I'm hopeful that technology can do that. And that's just in a kind of sustaining way. Of course, there's also sort of big crazy tech, you know, like nuclear fission or wherever that the case may be, to come in, and that too will also need technology alongside.
Yeah, I agree with all of that, and I think look, I think technology has to be part of our response here, because like, as much as the political process is important, the truth is, like, we've been on this for decades now, and our political institutions at global level have failed us, right? Like, we, time and again, right, have said there's this threshold that we shouldn't cross, or this threshold, and, you know, and then we march straight through them. So I think you mustn't give up on that, but it would be crazy not to think that you would want optionality of aggressive investment in technology to give you new solutions or other ways out. And I think one of the bits of this that I think is potentially really exciting is the extent to which, you know, as the technology comes out of the labs and is built into the sorts of, you know, Stephen's point about, you know, like products and businesses, not just ideas, like that's where behavior starts to change. So if you look at all the debate around things like alternative proteins and cultured meats, like that's as much a story about how you make this interesting and exciting, engaging for the consumer, as it is about fats and proteins and molecules and whatever else. And I think there'll be stuff that happens in the future where, again, like most of the change is driven by people. So, you know, all the really exciting stuff around things like controlled environment, agriculture, and what you can do if you've got like incredible data visibility into your food supply chain has a potential to help you grow better crops that taste better, that are help people lead healthier lifestyles, and we don't waste any of it, and we cut out our food miles, and we deal with, you know, all the energy intensity. Like, together, what it boils down to is you get food that tastes better and costs you less money and doesn't destroy the planet. So, you know, somewhere in there, there's this thing about taking the technology and applying it and figuring out the culture and the business model and how I make it exciting. But I'm optimistic.
Yeah, I was about to say it's a good place to look at that word optimism, because I agree. It's easy to be cynical about that, but if we think about big technologies that were developed in the 50s, say like fridges, or, you know, stuff that's ubiquitous in our lives now, the first versions were, you know, catastrophic for the environment and for the planet. And simply because I just don't think it was just not on the agenda. It was just not one of the KPIs. It was not one of the things you had to factor in and optimize around. And I think that there'll still be bad behavior. People are people and all that. But I think that certainly from an investment point of view, or from a capital point of view, the message has been heard. I mean, again, I think Trump was a kind of aberration, that, clean coal bullshit and things like that. But I think, I know from banking that if you want to extract coal nowadays, no one's going to lend you money. No one's going to finance your venture. It's just not going to happen anymore. And I think that's irreversible. That's just not. It's also just a much bigger opportunity to create jobs and wealth around new technologies in that sense. So I'm really, really bullish on that. I think we just didn't know in the past, and then the thing that we didn't know had yielded so much profit and so much wealth for individuals who became powerful that they didn't want to step away from it. But now the pendulum has just swung away from that, and I think there's a huge opportunity to build KPIs into this process that we can map from other places. To imagine the mind that growth hacked Uber or Facebook or something, applying that kind of thinking to avoiding bad outcomes for nature or biodiversity. That's all doable, eminently doable. And I think the exciting thing is, I don't know how you see this, Chris, but I think the best practitioners in that stuff are really up for new challenges. And I think that's a kind of cultural shift. That it used to be, I want infinite money, and of course there's still billionaires, and you can say billionaires are a bad outcome of a corrupt system or whatever. But I think there are a bunch of people now who are really excellent at what they do and have made a bunch of money, who now want to do different things and look at the world differently. And it's easy to be cynical about that, but I think they do exist genuinely.
Yeah, no, I agree.
I'm really struck. Sorry, Chris. One of the second stage, because you talk, Stephen, in your podcast quite a lot about the difference between first stage entrepreneurs and second stage, ones that have already done it and been through that. And one of the ones we've got based at CodeBase is Pawprint and Cristiano. And that I'm optimistic in terms of that individual level behavior change, that kind of data-led personal kind of awareness raising, almost taking your carbon footprint and treating it a bit like your health, might have an ability to impact. And their funding model is quite different, using a sort of Brewdog crowdfunding approach rather than going down the pure VC model. So I think, in answer to Jenny's question, I'm optimistic tech will be there and help us. Sorry, Chris, you carry on.
Yeah, well, it's exactly your point, actually, which is like one of the things that technology gives us that we haven't had in the past is the ability to know, right? To know like what our impact is and like how it accumulates at different points in the supply chain or the production process, or how when we make one decision or another, it's going to affect things. And one of the things that's going to matter in here is like you either need then tools that consumers can use and find value in, and I think there's a real challenge in there. It's a bit like the conversations about, well, what if I sold everybody an app that could fix their privacy settings on social media, or what if I make sure that everybody owns their data and like authorizes who can access it and who can't access it. And I think it's a lovely idea that 99% of people haven't got the time for. So you've either got to figure out a way of presenting this that like goes with the grain of people's lives, or you've got to figure out like, is there a different institutional settlement? Like, should I be able to outsource, tracking of my in this case, my climate impacts and some of the decisions around that to somebody who gives me advice, right back and says, you need to stop eating this and you need to change your car or whatever it is. And if so, then is that the job of the government? Is that something that an entrepreneur should build? Is it something else entirely? Does it belong in the charity sector? And I don't know the answer, right? We probably need people to try a bunch of stuff to the point there about experimentation.
Exactly. I can give you a real world example of that. So, I know a couple of people who work in sort of for very large banks and banking apps, and banking apps now can tell you, hey, you've eaten a lot of pies, or you've bought too many cigarettes, or something like that. And if they've got millions of users, they can A/B test that. They can test and see if people are have willingness for that. And it's super fascinating to see a kind of, again, it's loathful to say it, but like a new normal as to what people find acceptable. So people will find it completely unacceptable for a financial institution to give you advice or caution on your eating habits or drinking habits or anything like that. Yep. But they will totally love you if you stop them from gambling, right?
Yeah.
Weirdly, right? They'll say, yeah, please put a limit on my gambling thing that I can only do a tenner a day or a month or whatever it may be. At the same time, people are super happy to leave the whole dietary well-being thing to a startup. They've never heard, they don't know who they are or anything like that. So I think we're kind of working out and as you said, like experimenting around that space of using our personal data to navigate a different world. But at any rate, the whole question, like even the issue around wokeness, for example, I think was massively driven by data availability. If you can see that, people in Flint, Michigan, have terrible drinking water, and it's like, boom, here's the proof, here's the evidence, or just, it's just looking the other day, Black Americans weren't allowed to have mortgages until the 70s or something. So how can they generate wealth or be part of a meritocracy or whatever you want to call it? It's just unfair, and the availability of that data that shows you that that's just the case is will have political and ideological and ethical ramifications. But the beautiful thing is it will immediately also have technological ramifications too. New products will be brought to level that playing field or to change the game. And I'm really optimistic about that. And I think the only thing, the danger is that we don't let these people play. That's the only thing that's just a no-go. You just have to make it easy for everyone to access this stuff. And it goes back to education again, sadly. So it's a huge, difficult thing. Again, that's where I think maybe a new institution could say, our founding thing is this has to be equitable, has to be anti-racist, it has to be available for everyone. That given, I'm super optimistic about new things coming about.
Yeah, I think it also goes to the qualities that we look for in our political leaders. So like one of the defining trends of the internet era and the explosion of data is also like the distance between elites and authority and the public has been collapsed. And so, whereas it used to be the case the government would control the narrative and publish the facts, and it's very difficult to dispute the facts, you're now in an environment where, as a political leader, if you stand on stage and assert something, probably, it's like count in the seconds, if not minutes, before somebody on Twitter debunks you, right, with the evidence that proves why what you said isn't right. So, like this world of more data and more people empowered to make more decisions and shine more light on authority requires leaders who are much more humble about the limits of their knowledge and much more frank with the public about the trade-offs and the complexity and levels with us that, rather than promise the date on which the pandemic will be over, have the grown-up conversation that actually we don't know, but these are the things that we're balancing. But that's not what we select for in our politicians at the moment. So there's something around all of this which is, and if you don't solve that, then you get this almost frustration where all the people that want to do the things that you just described hit a system which is like in a different reality.
Absolutely. And we have this, epistemic, confusion, and no one knows anything anymore. But I'm super optimistic about that as well. I think it's a huge problem at the moment, but I do think it will be solved almost just through gravity, because it's like understanding truth. Chris, tell me if this is total bullshit. I think that. So if you remember, like back in the day, you would look at graphics on a computer game, and they were kind of terrible, but they were amazing for the time. And then, a couple of generations later, you get a new game and the graphics were even better. But again, you have this new normal every time. And until, say someone who's got, 80-year-old eyes would look at a game now and say, oh, is that real? Is that? But someone who's 15 is like, no, that's not real. Those are pixels. Look at that. That's so that kind of sophistication around truth seeing, I think will just weed itself out or just work itself out somehow. So I'm kind of optimistic. I used to be really scared about that. This could be a silly thought, but that's the kind of thing I'm telling myself these days anyway.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And I think definitely like a lot of the data on different generations' sophistication and critical thinking online. And like some discussions I've had with people recently about, you know, the credulity that you attach lots of the online conspiracy theory nightmare. It's like, if you're not on the internet at all, you think it's all bananas. If you're like quite on the internet, a lot of it seems quite persuasive. And then if you're like really on the internet, it's obvious that it's nuts.
Yeah.
But there's this like bit in the middle where it's like, you know, some knowledge, but the, you know, lack of tools and capabilities to pass it is the real challenge. Yeah.
I'm really struck we're into our last 5 minutes. The hour has whizzed by. There's loads of things we haven't covered that we've touched on. So things like the availability of tech. Almost, Stephen mentioned the rise of Trump, and that idea that as the world moves faster, we risk leaving some people behind. There's also a question there from Jenny has emailed in about interdisciplinary schools. I'm not sure we can get through all that in the next 5 minutes. So if you could pick one thing, both of you, to leave the audience with, or one thing to change that you really want to see happen in the next 6 months to a year in Scotland, what would it be?
Off you go.
One thing. But one thing that I do think is feasible, to that point that I made earlier around like enterprise and public services, I think you could do a much better job of opening up, like using technology to open up public service delivery so that entrepreneurs can have a better shot at doing well and doing good at the same time.
Yeah, but I would say my wish would be a little more abstract. It's just that willingness to experiment and try more things and just be a little bit more open. It's probably too wishy-washy because the actual mechanics to make that happen are really difficult. I'm working kind of hard myself to try and articulate what a new institution could look like that could kind of sit between government and education and investment and startup entrepreneurship. So something like that tries to make a good go. Yeah, that would be it for me.
Brilliant. Well, food for thought, and as always, my mind is blown talking to you two. There's so much in there and so much to think about, and I think for anyone that's not heard from either of you before, I do really recommend listening to Stephen's podcast, which is now one of the top ones in the world. He told me this morning. Yeah, you did almost. Some wording similar to that. And Stephen's blog is really, Chris's blog on particularly on these new institutions and how the world needs to change, I think has given us lots and lots of food for thought. So this is a slightly different format from how the David Hume Institute normally works. So if you've got feedback on that, do let us know. I've really enjoyed my time with both of you, and I hope the audience does too. We can't thank you and clap, that feels a bit funny online, but heartfelt thanks from everyone here. And thank you for joining us today, everybody. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Take it easy.
Bye.
Bye.